We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's edition, we are talking political pathways. Who's gotten lost and who knows where they're going? All that and a whole lot more. Please do remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. And for these purposes, a New Yorker too. Hi, Tim. Thanks for being here.
Hello, Mark. Good to be here, as always.
So, Tim, I think what we really have to discuss, first and foremost, is what happened in New York. We had the Democratic primary this week just gone, and it was won by somebody who is an avowed socialist.
Mm-hmm.
What happened?
A democratic socialist, which is the politically acceptable term for socialist, because that's what he is. He has stirred up anti-Semitic feelings in New York. He is, as you say, an avowed socialist who wants to basically run the wealthy and corporations out of New York by raising taxes to an even more inconceivably high level than the ones that have already driven a lot of wealthy people and corporations out of New York, the people who pay the taxes, the people who, carry the burden for all of the city services that were provided, for example, as Exhibit A. Millions of illegal aliens who were shipped there and then housed, fed, and taken care of at taxpayers' expense. Now, the Democrats must have a really short memory. They can't even think back to last November and what happened when a true progressive in Kamala Harris, not that different than Mamdani, the Muslim who won the Democratic primary, not that different. And you saw what happened is that people roundly rejected that. But beyond that, you would have thought they'd think back to the days of Bill de Blasio, who, by the time he left office, was at about 20% approval. He was essentially, I don't know whether he officially called himself this or not, but he was a socialist, quasi-Marxist himself. The city went to hell, and that's why they elected Eric Adams, because he was the least progressive and the most pro-police of a field of Democrats, which were predictably progressive from end to end.
I should point out here, Tim, that we're not even considering that New York could have elected a Republican, are we? We say they went to the least progressive of the Democrats because they're not going to elect a Republican, right?
Well, they have in the past.
Of course.
Giuliani but Giuliani was the only one who was a real Republican as opposed to a Republican in name only.
Like Michael Bloomberg.
Michael Bloomberg, who was by most accounts a very effective mayor. But he was not a
Democrat, then Republican, then Independent.
And you had John Lindsay, who was a disaster as a extremely liberal Republican that was basically to the left even of the Democratic machine in New York. So
well, let's talk about John Lindsay for a moment, Tim. So John Lindsay, 1967, I think, 67.
65 was when he was first elected, and then he sought re-election in 1969. And I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't even prompt you, but I have a remarkable story from that year that involved John Lindsay. If you would like me to share.
I'd love to hear it.
So my father was pretty heavily involved in Republican and conservative politics in New York City, which, of course, as the expression goes, the conservatives could have met in a phone booth. But nevertheless, there was conservative resistance to a left-wing Democratic policy in New York. And when Lindsay, who was becoming more and more unpopular, was running, John Lindsay, for re-election in 1969, he was challenged by an obscure Staten Island assemblyman named John Markey. Nobody gave him any chance, of course, because he was underfunded, out of the mainstream, and Lindsay was was the pretty boy who had risen to the mayor's office. Long story short, although it's already long, my father was invited along with me as a 14-year-old to view the election returns at the candidates' headquarters. As it turns out, probably a hotel suite. I don't recall exactly, but I was there when the shocking result came in that John Markey had beaten John Lindsay. And it gave me, for the first and likely last time in my life, the opportunity to see a candidate in real time as he won an election. And he looked as stunned as everybody else. But the point is that when it came to the general election that November, Lindsay ran as an independent.
Yeah.
And John Markey got crushed, and Lindsay got another term, but he did it as an independent, which simply says that you cannot view New York City politics through the lens of national politics, because there's all kinds of crossovers. There's Conservative Party, Liberal Party. People run as independents frequently, as we just discussed. You can lose a primary, win the election, and vice versa. So it's not like national politics.
Tim, you know what? I'm going to leave our listeners with the campaign slogan of John Lindsay, and I think I've got this right. Before we come back after this short break, I care about you. We'll be right back.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.